The snow started falling before anyone noticed me standing near the back of the room. At the Vance family reunion, snow was supposed to be decorative, something soft and cinematic beyond the tall windows of the estate in Highland Park. Inside, the lights were warm, the wine was expensive, and the air hummed with polite laughter from people who believed they were among the right kind of family. My mom noticed me before the snow did. Margaret Vance stopped mid-conversation, lifted her glass, and turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't pull me aside. She wanted everyone to hear this. She said my name the way you say a word you're about to erase. She called me a stain on the Vance family. She said I had taken advantage of my father while he was sick. She said I had tried to position myself for money that wasn't mine. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when people sense permission to judge. My sister Sloane stepped forward then, calm and composed, placing a small stack of photos onto the table like exhibits in a trial I hadn't agreed to attend. Before I could open my mouth, my mom lifted her glass and threw the red wine directly onto my dress. It soaked through the fabric, cold and sticky. She pointed toward the door, already open, snow blowing in. She told me to leave. I didn't say a word. I turned and walked out into the night. The estate behind me didn't pause. The music resumed almost immediately. Laughter returned, softer at first, then full again. No one followed me. No one asked if I was okay. The door closed with a final, practiced sound, and I stood there in the snow with wine on my skin and the sudden clarity that I hadn't been thrown out in anger. I had been removed. The Vance house had always been more institution than home. It was old money architecture built to impress donors, partners, and people who needed to believe in the idea of family values. My mom was the keeper of that image. Margaret curated loyalty the way other people curated art. She knew exactly which stories to tell and which faces to put forward. Sloane, my older sister, fit perfectly into that frame. She was elegant, strategic, and always on the right side of the room. I had never been either of those things. I was the youngest, the quiet one who showed up late and left early. I wasn't part of the daily performance. That made me invisible when things were good and disposable when things weren't. Standing in that room, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. The accusations weren't improvised. The timing wasn't emotional. This wasn't a family argument that got out of hand. It was a presentation. Margaret had spoken in the language of morality, not rage. Sloane hadn't defended me because there was nothing to defend in the version of the story they were selling. It had been framed cleanly, efficiently, and with witnesses. By the time the wine hit my dress, the verdict had already been reached. I felt the instinct to explain rise up in my chest, to tell them where I had been during my father's illness, to say who had taken him to appointments, who had stayed up through the nights when he couldn't remember where he was. I could have spoken. I could have fought. I didn't. Defending myself in that moment would have made me look exactly like what they accused me of being. Desperate, guilty, disruptive. Silence was the only move that didn't belong to them. When I bent down to pick up my coat, my hand brushed against the edge of a notebook that had slipped out of my bag. I paused, then picked it up too. It was the journal I had kept while caring for my father. Dates, medications, notes about his confusion, reminders to call the doctor. I hadn't planned to take it with me. I hadn't planned anything beyond getting through the night, but something told me not to leave it behind. Inside the house, my mom was already turning back to her guests, wine glass refilled, smile restored. The party continued as if I had never been there. Outside, the snow fell harder, quiet and unbothered. I didn't look back at the house. I stood there long enough to understand the truth of what had just happened. I hadn't been humiliated because I had done something wrong. I had been humiliated because I was inconvenient. And whatever my family was protecting that night, it wasn't their reputation. It was something much more fragile. The cold followed me longer than I expected. I stood outside the estate for a few seconds after the door shut, snow collecting in my hair, listening to the muffled return of music inside. The party hadn't paused for reflection. It had paused for logistics. Once I was gone, the room reset itself with practiced ease. That was when I understood it wasn't personal. It was procedural. I walked down the long drive alone. No footsteps behind me. No one calling my name. The humiliation hadn't been an emotional outburst that embarrassed the family. It had been the final step of a process. They had finished with me, and the night moved on. Inside, I knew exactly what was happening without being there. My mom would be telling the story again, this time with sympathy layered carefully over accusation. She would lower her voice, shake her head, say how painful it was to watch a child lose her way. Guests would nod, relieved to be reassured that what they witnessed had been necessary, even noble. No one likes chaos, but people are very comfortable with cruelty when it's presented as responsibility. By morning, the silence had spread. My phone stayed quiet. No messages asking what happened. No apologies. Invitations I'd had on my calendar disappeared without explanation. Conversations I'd been part of for years simply stopped. It wasn't dramatic. It was efficient. In the Vance family, once a decision was made, everyone adjusted accordingly. The story traveled faster than I did. By the time I woke up, I could feel it already settling into place. I was no longer the daughter who had stepped away from the family. I was the cautionary tale. The one who had tried to take advantage during a vulnerable moment. The one Margaret had been brave enough to confront. People didn't need proof. They needed coherence. And my mom had given them that. Sloane's role became clearer as the hours passed. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't accused. She had curated. The photos she placed on the table weren't meant to convince anyone on their own. They were meant to complete the picture Margaret was painting. Concerned sister, troubled sibling, a family doing its best. It was subtle enough that no one would call it cruelty, strategic enough that no one would question it. That realization hurt more than the wine. I replayed the moment in my head more times than I wanted to admit. The second before my mom spoke. The instant when I could have interrupted her. I thought about all the things I could have said, all the details I could have offered. I knew exactly how it would have gone. Explaining myself would have turned the room against me faster. Truth delivered too early sounds like panic. Silence, on the other hand, unsettles people. Silence suggests there's more to come. So I stayed quiet. The cost of that silence showed up quickly. A meeting I had scheduled for the following week was suddenly postponed indefinitely. An email I sent to a longtime acquaintance received a polite reply that went nowhere. Friends who once checked in regularly offered vague sympathy without committing to anything. I wasn't just being avoided socially, I was being managed. That's when it clicked. The Vance name didn't operate like a family, it operated like a corporation. And I had been labeled a liability. What struck me most wasn't the anger. It was the precision. Margaret hadn't accused me of being careless or ungrateful. She accused me of financial misconduct, of manipulation, of positioning myself for money. Those weren't emotional charges, they were legal ones. The language mattered. I sat with that for a long time. The more I examined the accusation, the less it aligned with reality. The timeline didn't make sense. The certainty with which it was delivered didn't match the facts I knew. And yet it had been accepted without hesitation. That meant the truth had never been the point. The story had been rehearsed long before that night. By the end of the day, I stopped asking why they hated me. I started asking what they were protecting. If my presence alone was dangerous enough to warrant public humiliation, then whatever sat beneath the surface had to be fragile, valuable, vulnerable. People don't burn bridges unless they're afraid of what's on the other side. That was the moment my role in the family finally made sense. I hadn't been expelled because I embarrassed them. I had been removed because I might notice something they didn't want seen. Silence wasn't just a consequence, it was a threat. And the more they tried to erase me, the clearer it became that the lie they fed the room that night wasn't built to last. 2 weeks passed without a single message from my family. No calls, no emails, no carefully worded concern disguised as obligation. The silence wasn't empty. It was intentional, like a door held shut from the other side. I moved into a small apartment near Lake Michigan, the kind of place that felt temporary even after the boxes were unpacked. I didn't bring much with me. A suitcase of clothes, my laptop, and the notebook I had picked up on my way out of the house that night. Everything else felt unnecessary, like it belonged to a version of my life that had already been edited out. My days settled into a quiet routine. I worked, cooked simple meals, went on long walks along the water when the weather allowed. I stayed off social media. I didn't look up my mom's name or check what people were saying. If the story was still being told, it didn't need my participation. Letting it run without me was the first choice that felt entirely mine. At night, when the city went quiet, I opened the notebook. It wasn't sentimental. There were no dramatic confessions or emotional entries, just dates, times, notes written quickly between hospital visits and late-night phone calls. Medication changes, doctor appointments, moments when my father didn't recognize where he was. I had written it to keep myself steady during a period when everything else felt unstable. I hadn't realized then that I was documenting something far more valuable than memory. As I read through it again, patterns emerged that I hadn't noticed before. There were days when my father was lucid for an hour and then gone again. Weeks when he couldn't track time, when he signed his name shakily or forgot he had already done so. I remembered those days clearly, sitting beside him, repeating answers, watching confusion settle over his face like fog. That was when the question formed fully in my mind. If he couldn't remember my name some mornings, how could he have knowingly approved complex financial decisions? I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't assume anyone had done anything illegal yet. I focused on process instead of blame. Who had access to paperwork? Who controlled information while my father was sick? Who benefited from decisions made during that window? The accusations my mom had thrown at me suddenly sounded less emotional and more procedural. The language she used had structure, intent, preparation. It made me uneasy. I thought back to the months leading up to my father's death, how certain conversations had shifted, how questions were deflected, how decisions were presented as already finalized. At the time, I had assumed it was grief, or stress, or the way families behave when control starts slipping. Now it felt like something else entirely. Late one evening, while scrolling through old emails, I saw a name I hadn't thought about in years. Arthur. He had been the family's attorney for as long as I could remember. Quiet, meticulous, never overly familiar. During my father's illness, Arthur had been present at meetings, taking notes, asking careful questions, and then, suddenly, he was gone. The explanation given at the time was vague. A difference in vision. A change in direction. I hadn't questioned it. Now I wondered why someone so precise would be removed at the exact moment clarity was most needed. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time before clicking it. I didn't write a long message. I didn't explain what had happened at the reunion or mention the accusations. I kept it simple. I asked if he was willing to speak with me about my father's final months. I sent it and closed my laptop before I could overthink it. The phone rang the next afternoon. Arthur's voice sounded cautious, but not surprised. He didn't ask why I was calling. He didn't ask how I was. He asked where I was and whether I felt comfortable meeting in person. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. When we spoke, I asked only one question. During the final months of my father's life, what documents were signed? There was a pause on the line. Not a long one, just enough to confirm that my instincts weren't misplaced. Arthur didn't say much after that. He said it would be better to talk face to face. He suggested a time and place. Neutral, private. When the call ended, I sat back and looked around the apartment. The lake outside was calm, gray, and endless. For the first time since that night at the estate, I felt something close to certainty. I hadn't been pushed out because I was a problem. I had been pushed out because I was observant, because my presence created friction in a system that depended on smooth surfaces and unquestioned authority. Whatever my family was hiding, it wasn't about love or resentment. It was about paper, signatures, timing. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They hadn't erased me to punish me. They erased me because I might start asking the right questions. Arthur chose a small office above a dry cleaner on a side street I had driven past 100 times without noticing. No signage, no receptionist, no trace of the Vance name anywhere. That alone told me this conversation wasn't meant to be comfortable. He looked older than I remembered. Not frail, just careful. The kind of man who had learned when silence kept him safer than answers. We exchanged pleasantries we didn't mean. Then he closed the door, locked it, and pulled a slim folder from his briefcase. "I'm not here to speculate," he said, "only to show you what exists." He laid the documents out slowly, as if pacing mattered. Loan agreements, amendments, trust-related paperwork. The dates clustered together in a narrow window I recognized immediately. The final months of my father's life, the months when he struggled to stay oriented, when he asked the same question 3 times in a row, when he needed reminders to eat. My name appeared more than once, not as a beneficiary, not as an observer, as a guarantor, a proxy, a consenting party. The total exposure ran into the millions. I didn't react at first. I just stared at the pages, absorbing the shape of the damage. It wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. "These were executed while your father's condition was documented as declining," Arthur said, "which is why I objected." "Objected," I repeated. He nodded. "I asked for independent assessments, delays, clarifications. I was told I was being obstructive." I picked up one of the pages and looked at the signature line. My father's name sat there in familiar ink. Too familiar. The letters were formed correctly, but something about them felt wrong. The pressure was uneven, the spacing inconsistent. It looked like the work of someone repeating a motion they no longer fully understood. "That one," Arthur said quietly, "was signed on a day he couldn't remember what year it was." The room felt suddenly smaller. I thought back to those mornings, to how my father would stare at his hands like they belonged to someone else, to how he trusted whoever spoke with the most confidence, whoever sounded certain. My mother had always sounded certain. "What about my signature?" I asked. Arthur didn't hesitate. "Forged or replicated from prior documents. It would not withstand scrutiny." There it was. Not an accusation, a fact. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. The reunion, the wine, the public humiliation. None of it had been spontaneous. They hadn't discredited me because I embarrassed them. They had discredited me because my name was already entangled in something they didn't want examined too closely. I had been removed from the board before I could ask for minutes. I sat back and let the pieces align. The language my mother used that night. Financial, legal, specific. Not the words of a woman lashing out, the words of someone protecting a structure. Sloane's calm, the timing, the rehearsed certainty. They hadn't pushed me out because I was dangerous emotionally. I was dangerous procedurally. "There's something else," Arthur said after a pause. "Something I didn't include in the formal file." He didn't reach for it. He didn't show me anything. He just acknowledged its existence. "A video," he said, "from the house, not financial, behavioral." I looked at him. "Of my father?" "Yes." "And my mother?" Arthur nodded once. "It shows coercion, clear enough that no amount of interpretation would soften it." I didn't ask to see it, not yet. Knowing it existed was enough. Truth didn't need to be revisited immediately. It needed to be placed. Instead, I asked a different question. "Who owns the debt right now?" Arthur studied me for a moment, then answered carefully. He named the institutions, the structures, the vulnerabilities. He understood what I was asking without me having to explain it. Control didn't come from exposing the lie. It came from owning the consequences of it. When I left his office, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I walked back to my car with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. That night, I spread the documents across my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I created a new folder and named it V Legacy. Not for revenge, not for inheritance, for continuity, for correction. They thought they had erased me from the equation. In reality, they had handed me the variables: every signature, every date, every rushed decision made while no one thought I was watching. If the truth came out too early, it would be dismissed as bitterness. If it came out too late, it would look like opportunism. But at the right moment, with the right structure behind it, it wouldn't look like an attack at all. It would look like accountability. The morning after I met Arthur, nothing in my life looked different from the outside. I didn't call my mom. I didn't confront Sloan. I didn't hint at what I knew or what I planned to do. The truth had weight now, and I understood something I hadn't before. Truth without timing was just noise. I went to work, I answered emails, I cooked dinner in my small kitchen, and washed the dishes by hand. Anyone watching me would have assumed I was doing what everyone expected, licking my wounds, adjusting to exile. They would have been wrong. I started by formalizing what had already taken shape in my head. V Legacy wasn't born out of anger. It was born out of necessity. I created it as a separate legal entity with a purpose that sounded benign enough to never draw attention. Asset preservation, estate continuity, long-term stewardship. Words my family respected because they hid control behind responsibility. I made sure nothing tied it back to me publicly. No direct lines, no obvious fingerprints. On paper, I remained exactly what my family had painted me as: the disgraced daughter who had disappeared after the snow. The absence worked in my favor. People stop watching what they believe is finished. From there, I focused on information. Quietly, patiently. I mapped the financial exposure Arthur had outlined, lender by lender, obligation by obligation. I didn't contact anyone directly. I used intermediaries, consultants, shell conversations that asked questions without revealing interest. The picture that emerged was worse than I expected. The family company was fragile. Cash flow was tight. Debt had been layered strategically to buy time and appearances. Everything depended on confidence, on no one asking the wrong questions, on my father's signature carrying more authority than his condition ever could. That fragility explained the urgency. A few days later, I learned that Sloane's engagement had been moved up. Not announced publicly, just enough whispers in the right circles to suggest acceleration. The wedding wasn't about romance, it was about reassurance, about showing the world that the Vance family was stable, unified, and moving forward. That kind of event calmed lenders. It soothed partners. It bought credibility. I made a note and kept going. Margaret, meanwhile, was thriving, or at least appearing to. Her name surfaced in invitations and press releases, panels, charity boards. She was being praised for resilience, for values, for holding the family together during a difficult period. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so calculated. The worse my reputation became, the cleaner hers looked. I let it happen. Correcting the record too soon would have turned me into the problem again. So I stayed quiet and watched the lie grow. Lies collapse harder when they're allowed to climb. Arthur checked in once briefly. He confirmed the video was secure, untouched, preserved exactly as it had been recorded. No edits, no enhancements, just time and context waiting to do their work. He asked if I was certain I wanted to use it. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I asked what the next major public event was. Something with media, with donors, with attention that couldn't be redirected once it landed. He didn't need long to answer. The Gratitude and Morality Gala. Margaret was being honored. Cameras would be present. Statements would be recorded. The narrative would be fully committed. That was the moment everything aligned. The debt timelines, the wedding, the gala. All of it converged in a narrow window where confidence was high and scrutiny was low. Where no one would expect interruption, where denial would look weak instead of defensive. I spent the next few days preparing without rush, finalizing structures, reviewing contingencies, making sure that when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't stand alone. Evidence without consequence is just spectacle. I wasn't interested in spectacle. By the end of the week, V Legacy was operational. The framework was in place. The numbers made sense. Every path forward had been tested twice. I didn't feel excited. I didn't feel afraid. I felt resolved. On my last walk along the lake before the gala, the wind cut sharply across the water. Snow flurries drifted in and disappeared before they could settle. I thought about the night I had been thrown out of the house, soaked in wine, standing alone while my family returned to their party. They believed that moment had ended me. In reality, it had given me time. They thought I vanished after the snow. They told themselves I was gone, broken, irrelevant. While they celebrated survival and praised their own morality, I was building something they couldn't see and wouldn't outrun. By the time they realized what was happening, there would be no conversation left to have. The city had learned how to celebrate without me. The night of the Gratitude and Morality Gala arrived polished and effortless, as if nothing beneath it had ever cracked. The venue sat downtown, all marble and glass, washed in warm light that softened everything it touched. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside, ornamental this time, photographed by guests as if winter itself had been invited for effect. I wasn't on the guest list. I didn't need to be. From across the street, I watched donors step out of black cars, coats draped over arms, faces already arranged into expressions of benevolence. Cameras flashed, names were exchanged. Inside, the room filled with the sound of practiced admiration. This was the world my family understood best. Applause as currency, image as armor. My mom was the centerpiece. Margaret Vance moved through the crowd like someone who believed the floor belonged to her. She wore confidence the way other women wore diamonds. When she reached the front of the room, the applause came easily, eagerly. People stood. They smiled at her as if gratitude itself had taken human form. She accepted it with a nod that suggested humility, the kind that reads well on a stage. From where I stood, unseen, I recognized the language before she even spoke. Gratitude, sacrifice, family, values, words that had once been used to explain why I needed to be patient, why questions were inconvenient, why loyalty meant silence. Sloane sat near the front, elegant and composed, her hand resting lightly on her fiancé's knee. They looked like the future everyone in that room wanted to believe in. Stability, continuity, the illusion that nothing had been disrupted, only refined. She didn't look toward the doors. She had no reason to. As far as she knew, the threat had already been escorted out into the snow weeks ago. The narrative had hardened by then. Reporters scribbled notes, nodding along as my mom spoke about perseverance and moral clarity. No one challenged her. No one asked about the daughter she hadn't mentioned. The story was complete without me. I waited. Behind the scenes, everything was ready. Arthur had confirmed it earlier in a message that didn't use unnecessary words. The video was secured, verified, time-stamped, no edits, no commentary, just the truth, preserved the way it had happened. I hadn't watched it again. I didn't need to. Knowing it existed was enough. I stood just outside the main hall for a moment, listening to the applause swell as my mom reached the emotional peak of her speech. I could feel it through the doors. The collective satisfaction of a room convinced it was witnessing something good. I checked my breathing. Calm, steady. There was no anger left in me. No rush, only certainty. When I stepped inside, no one noticed. The lights dimmed slightly as the program transitioned, attention narrowing toward the stage. My mom stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on the edges, her smile practiced and sincere. She spoke about gratitude as if it were something she had earned, about morality as if it were inherited. That was when the screen behind her flickered. At first, it looked like a technical issue, a brief shift in color, a sound glitch that made a few people turn in their seats. My mom glanced back once, confused, then returned her gaze to the audience, still smiling. The image stabilized. A hospital room appeared on the screen. The sound came in before recognition did, a familiar voice, sharp and impatient. My mom's voice. The room went still as the image sharpened, revealing my father in a bed, smaller than I remembered him. his eyes unfocused. Papers were held close to him, too close. A pen pressed into his hand. His confusion was visible even from a distance. No one spoke. I watched the moment land, slow and devastating. I watched faces change as understanding replaced confusion. I watched phones lift instinctively, the story shifting in real time. My mom reached for the microphone, but the words didn't come. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked out at the room, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I stepped forward then, finally visible. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at my mom as I passed her. I looked at the room, at the people who had believed the version of her that required my silence. "I won't take much of your time," I said, my voice steady in the sudden quiet. The video speaks for itself. Sloan had gone pale. Her fiancé shifted beside her, his expression unreadable. My mom stood frozen, the woman who had commanded the room moments ago now unable to claim it back. "This isn't about revenge," I continued. "It's about correction." I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. The lie had collapsed on its own. And in that moment, as the applause faded into something closer to dread, I understood something clearly. Nothing destroys a lie faster than applause that stops too suddenly. And the room was finally ready to listen. The room didn't gasp when the video ended. It didn't whisper or murmur or erupt into chaos. It did something far worse for my mom. It went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for permission. For a few seconds, no one moved. My father's image lingered on the screen behind the stage, frozen in a moment no one in that room could unsee. The sound cut out. The lights stayed where they were. My mom stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges as if the wood might keep her upright. She reached for the microphone instinctively, the way she always did when things threatened to slip. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. That was when the phones went up, not all at once, but steadily. One screen, then another. People weren't recording out of excitement. They were documenting, preserving. The narrative had shifted, and everyone in that room understood it on a visceral level. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was exposure. Sloan was the first to move. She turned toward her fiancé, her face tight, eyes searching for reassurance that wasn't there. He didn't meet her gaze. He stood slowly, deliberately, and stepped back from her chair. The distance was small, but in that moment, it might as well have been an ocean. He reached up, removed the ring from her finger, and placed it gently on the table between them. No argument, no explanation, just withdrawal. My mom finally found her voice. "This is taken out of context," she said too loudly, the words sharp with panic. "You don't understand what you're seeing." But the room had already understood. Context doesn't matter when coercion is visible, when fear is audible, when the truth doesn't need interpretation to feel wrong. I stepped forward again, not to confront her, but to anchor the moment before it fractured into noise. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at her. I looked at the people who had applauded minutes earlier. "My name is Elena Vance," I said, "and I'm here in a different capacity tonight." Arthur moved to my side, calm and precise, the way he always was when facts mattered more than feelings. "The entity known as V Legacy," I continued, "was established to preserve my father's estate and interests after his death. Earlier this week, V Legacy acquired the outstanding debt tied to the Vance family holdings." The words landed one by one heavy and irreversible. "In practical terms," I said, "that means control has already changed hands." My mom shook her head, a small, frantic motion. "You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "This is my family." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt nothing resembling triumph. "This stopped being a family matter the moment you turned it into a transaction," I said. "The video didn't take anything from you. It showed what was already taken." Two uniformed officers entered the room quietly, speaking first to event staff, then moving toward the stage. There was no dramatic announcement, no handcuffs, just procedure. The kind of calm that follows decisions made long before anyone steps into a room. My mom saw them and finally understood what had happened. The allies she had counted on avoided her eyes. The donors shifted away. The applause that had carried her to the podium had evaporated, leaving her standing alone under the lights. Sloane didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched, the ring untouched on the table beside her. Whatever future she had imagined for herself dissolved in the space between two breaths. I didn't linger. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said, my voice steady as the officers approached. "I'm here to correct a record and restore what was misused." I gestured once toward the screen, now dark. That footage wasn't revenge, it was documentation, and documentation doesn't argue. Arthur nodded, already moving to coordinate the next steps. The officers spoke softly to my mom, guiding her away from the stage. She didn't resist. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the certainty that had always protected her. As she was escorted out, cameras flashed. Not in celebration, in confirmation. I stood where I was, the center of the room slowly emptying around me. People didn't approach. They didn't congratulate me. They watched from a distance, unsure how to engage with someone who had just dismantled a legacy without raising her voice. That was fine. What ended that night wasn't my family. Families fracture quietly all the time. What ended was the lie holding them together. The one that said authority was the same thing as morality. The one that said silence meant consent. As the doors closed behind the last of the officers, the room exhaled. And for the first time since the snow-covered night I was thrown out of that house, I didn't feel erased. I felt finished. The morning after the gala arrived without ceremony. No headlines blared from my phone. No frantic calls broke the quiet. The city outside my window looked the same as it always had, gray and steady, as if nothing important had happened at all. That was how I knew it was over. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, watching steam rise and disappear. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. What I felt was absence. The constant tension I had carried since the night I was thrown out was gone, like a sound that stops so completely you only notice it afterward. I let the noise play out without me. Lawyers spoke to lawyers. Boards convened. Statements were drafted and revised and quietly shelved. I didn't give interviews. I didn't post explanations. Silence had done enough work already. It didn't need my help now. V-Legacy moved the way it was designed to, clean and procedural. Control of the estate and the company transferred without drama. There were no celebratory meetings, no speeches, just signatures, confirmations, and keys returned to the right hands. I never considered moving back into the house. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a structure built around a story that no longer existed. Instead, I made a different decision. The Vance estate was converted into a care institute focused on memory loss and elder support. The rooms where power had once been negotiated behind closed doors were repurposed for quiet dignity. There were no plaques bearing my name, no press releases framing it as generosity. It wasn't charity, it was course correction. A few days later, I visited my father's grave alone. The cemetery was quiet, the ground dusted with a thin layer of snow. I brought no flowers. I didn't speak out loud. I knelt and placed the family crest back onto his headstone, not to reclaim the name, but to return something that had been used without consent. He had tried to protect what he could with the time he had. I understood that now. "I fixed it," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who the words were for. I didn't seek closure with my mom. I didn't meet with Sloane. There were no final conversations, no apologies demanded or offered. Some relationships end not because they explode, but because they erode beyond repair. Distance wasn't punishment, it was maintenance. I changed my number. I closed accounts. I let the past settle into the place it belonged. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just finished. Leaving Chicago felt different this time. I packed lightly again, but there was no urgency in it, no escape. I stood by the lake one last morning, watching the water move in slow, indifferent rhythms. Snow fell gently, not the sharp, stinging kind I remembered from the night I was thrown out. This cold wasn't hostile, it was honest. I realized then that revenge had never been the point. I hadn't needed to hurt anyone to reclaim myself. I had needed to stop explaining, to stop begging for understanding from people who benefited from misunderstanding me. Power didn't come from shouting my truth into a room that had already decided who I was. It came from waiting, documenting, and choosing the moment when the truth could stand on its own. If you've ever been humiliated by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever been erased because you asked questions that made others uncomfortable, you're not alone. Sometimes the strongest response isn't confrontation, it's clarity. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. Share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments. And if you want to keep listening to stories about quiet justice, hidden strength, and people reclaiming their dignity without losing themselves, stay here with me. Subscribe to the channel and come back for the next story. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.